Um, it is March 7th today, and there was an announcement from EEOC, a press release that they're filing a lawsuit against one of the major casinos in the area. And so this usually brings about renewed interest in disability regulation compliance. So today I'm just going to talk about Disability Regulation Compliance 101. How do you do it? Let's talk about the basics. The first thing is that if you're an individual that owns a family residence, then none of this applies to you. The more complicated your business is, the more complicated ADA or disability regulation compliance becomes for you. There are a lot of different regulations that apply to your business, and some of them have some subsets of rules that comply with the requirements of persons with disabilities, and others are just rules that apply to compliance with disability regulations. So let me say this first. If you're a small business, then the United States Department of Justice, and you can find some links on our website, have some nice pamphlets that explain what it is you need to know for, say, small retail shop or something like that. If you're in a larger business, then when you get into larger businesses, it's really best to try to select a person with some knowledgeability about construction technologies and assign them to be your ADA coordinator. This is not normally a full-time job, but it would be, say, if you have an on-site construction manager who's working on little remodelings within your casino or your retail store, or if you're a big chain, then that person would be a good person to assign as an ADA coordinator, because a lot of the ADA compliance issues do have to do with construction technologies. There are also regulations that have to do with employment, and so it might be also good if that person was familiar with employment regulations. And you could also have a team, one in charge of employment and another one in charge of construction. But the point is, somebody has to be the point person for ADA compliance. And so if you've got a big facility and you're assigning a person to handle this issue for you, a lot of it should have been dealt with when the building was built, and a lot of it should have been dealt with when the program for what everybody does within the building was decided. But if not, or if that information is no longer up to date, then you could do an audit. And if you're talking about architectural construction technologies, then this is usually referred to as a site survey. So someone such as us would go to your property and walk around and look and ask questions, and then they would get back to you with a analysis and recommendations. Sometimes clients prefer not to have this in writing because they don't want to create documentation that they're out of compliance, but it's best to go ahead and get a written report, and then you can use it as a checklist for compliance. These site surveys, depending on the size of the project, are at least an all-day job and could be a multi-day job for, say, a whole casino or something like that. It could be a multi-week job. But when you're done, you have this survey, and you can use it as a tool to decide, what to do next. So what will the person who's the ADA coordinator want to know besides the information that's provided on the site survey? And that would be what regulations apply. And so most ADA coordinators attempt to write internal regulations they try to do kind of a lowest common denominator type thing to comply with all the various regulations. So let us say that the uh, electrical code says the center of your switch box can be a maximum of 48 inches above the finished floor, and that ADA or FHA or whatever it is you're dealing with, whichever set of regulations, ANSI 117.1, requires that the maximum control, the maximum distance from the control to the floor cannot exceed 48 inches. Well, then when you're looking at something like a thermostat, electric box at a thermostat is going to be mounted to, then your thermostat controls could be on the top of the box, so they would be outside the 48 inches. If you're dealing with, say, a daycare or something like that, you may want everything to be substantially lower, because then you're dealing with smaller scale humans. And so your ADA coordinator can usually make a blanket statement that, say, throughout the apartment complex, we're going to attempt to put no light switch boxes any higher than the top edge of the box being at 44 inches or something like that. And this has to do with a lot of other factors that they have to look at, and that's why familiarity with construction is helpful. So if you have switches and you're attempting to make them all the right height, then some of them may be beyond a reach over. A reach over is like a countertop and perhaps a splash that they would have to reach across to get to. Well, then they would know how high they wanted the counter to be based on other criteria, and then depending on how the splash is built beyond it, is, say, if you have a 4-inch splash and a 2'10" counter, then by subtraction what the bottom of the box minimum has to be. And of course you can always turn boxes horizontally instead of vertically, things like that. But the point is that somebody has to make those kind of decisions for an existing facility. For new construction documents, a lot of architects will hire a consultant, or large architectural firms will have what amounts to tantamount to an internal consultant. So there's somebody who's been assigned to be trained on all the disability regulations, and then when a designer wants to design something, they would have questions they could ask that person, or they could even set up internal controls to where that person checks all the plans before they go out or something like that. So there are a lot of regulations controlling construction, and some examples would be, of course, the ADA itself, and there are sections of the ADA that apply to government buildings and some that apply to typical commercial buildings. And then Fair Housing Amendments Act, FHA, has their own regulations. Most building codes, well, all building codes in Southern Nevada have adopted the ANSI A 117.1 regulations to comply with for disability compliance under the building code. If you're in California, the plan reviewers in the building departments there frequently are responding, they're giving you comments for compliance with the California version of the ADA. In Nevada, they don't do that. They do not review plans for ADA compliance or make comments about it very often. So it's incumbent on the project architect or the project engineer to make sure that they're in compliance with the ADA while they're getting comments back from the building department about ANSI A 117.1. Then there's the building code itself, and as I gave an example of earlier, the electrical code, which is part of the building code, might say that a electrical switch box cannot exceed whatever a given dimension. I don't want to date this from year to year because they're always changing the building code when they adopt a new one. And then we have what are called the Southern Nevada Amendments. And the Southern Nevada Amendments are um, an agreement among the local building officials of what they're going to do a little bit different from the building code itself. So um, when you go to do something, which one of these regulations do you have to comply with? If you comply with the electric code, is that good enough? You don't have to comply with the ADA or ANSI 117.1. No, you have to comply with all the regulations. And so compliance with one does not relieve you of compliance with the other regulations. And so it seems like it's extremely complicated at the beginning when you understand there's all sorts of different regulations, but once you've assigned an ADA coordinator, then your ADA coordinator will understand which regulations apply pretty quickly after they've taken on the job. So, for instance, if you have a casino, then the Fair Housing Amendments Act is not important to you. That's for multifamily residential and things like that. And so the kind of regulations that apply typically to your business will be understood by whoever your ADA coordinator is. Or if you just have one kind of business in multiple locations, say you have a series of laundromats or something like that, then after you understand how high to hang the change machine, you just know, and you don't really spend that much time considering which one of these regulations tells me that the change machine best be at whatever it is. You have the machine itself and how it's configured and where all the bells and whistles and switches are on it and all those things. So what are you going to try to do to make sure you don't make a mistake? And so this brings us to universal design. And what universal design is not a code regulation or a requirement, it's concept. So if you just design everything so that a wheelchair user can use it, or a person who's not a wheelchair user, or a person who has a hearing impairment, or a person who doesn't have a hearing impairment can use it, then you're not constantly fretting over, well, how shall I do this? So for instance, if you have your 15, 20-year-old change machine, 20, 25-year-old change machine that you've been using in all your laundromats forever, and you used to put it so that the bottom was at 48 inches above the finished floor, well then you can just figure out how best to optimize it. You don't have to replace it, just relocate it to the right height. When you build a new laundromat, assuming you're moving one from one to another, or you're remodeling one, or you've done something to trigger regulations applying to an old one you already built, then you just look at it and say, okay, well, we used to have these up high, but it's kind of nose level high, and I had a reason for doing it that way at the time. But if we lower them all down to, say, where the money comes out is at 2'10", then the highest control on it is at 40 inches, then people who are standing up and don't have any disabilities may find that to be a little bit low for them, but they can still use it. And nobody's going to decide not to come to your laundromat because your change machine is too low. This is just not something that happens. So this universal design idea of trying to figure out how to place things so that there's really no problem with it is the best choice for you as a small business operator. And as I said before, if you look for these pamphlets, which are available from the federal government, then they're going to pretty much all explain all this stuff to you, and then you'll have it for the built environment. So let's talk about a couple of concepts for the non-built environment. First of all, equal employment regulations. And so this was set up as not just a philanthropic gift to people with disabilities, but to integrate them into the society so that they would be able to hold a job and do what everybody else does, essentially have the same experience. And so you can get to looking at how your operation works and say to yourself, oh, I no person with a disability will ever work here or take this job or what have you. And then you're begging for somebody to come and sue you for non-compliance. So this is not a good idea. Again, it's relatively easy to make the building or the facility, whatever it is, accessible for persons with disabilities. And if somebody comes along and it's not, there's a concept called reasonable accommodations, which means that say you have 1,000 cubicles in your phone operation, and then you either hire a person who's a wheelchair user, or one of your employees becomes a wheelchair user, and then their station is not functioning for them. They ask if the desktop can be lowered down, or they can get a different kind of chair, or whatever it is. Then you are required to make those reasonable accommodations. And if you just look at it from a purely pragmatic standpoint, if you have to go retain a lawyer because there's a complaint against you, you're going to spend $5,000 at least on that. And so the facility staff member who comes and lowers the desktop down to the next notch, or finds a different chair for the person or something like that, really, really modest cost in relation to trying to deal with complaints. And logically, when you are accommodative to your staff, they're going to be more productive and hopefully longer term staff for you. So it makes some sense for a number of reasons besides just trying to be a good person and help people with disabilities. So this issue then goes on to the sort of similar experience type situation, and that takes a little bit more thinking. But again, for your potential ADA coordinator, say you have a hotel, and people sometimes say they want a view of the Las Vegas Strip, and other times they want a view of the mountains. And so you have a few, say, king-size rooms in a certain price point, and you don't want to have those all stacked one above the other in the same vertical location. You don't want to put them all on the ground floor where there's no view. You want them to be dispersed throughout the facility so that if one person who requires that type of room can have a view of the mountains and the other one a view of the Strip, or what have you. So looking at governmental facilities, schools, things like that, then the equivalent experience thing becomes a little bit more of a high level of order of the process of what you're doing there. So say you're a university and you have a lot of old buildings. The school district here has a lot of old buildings that are really just completely worn out, portable buildings that are scheduled to be removed. They keep pushing the schedule out year after year. Some of them are 20 years old. And so if you have a particular program just in one building, and that's the only place it's offered, then you really should not hold that in a non-compliant building. So for instance, say you have a after-school program for the community, maybe it's something to do with music, and then some days it's in the non-accessible building and some days it's in the new accessible building. Then from a program standpoint, the program is accessible and everybody gets the same experience. This can get a little bit of difficult to work out, because if the non-compliant building is only on Monday, Wednesday, and Fridays, and the compliant building is on Tuesday, Thursdays, or the compliant building has a piano in it and the non-compliant has an organ in it, and you can't switch them, then you're back in the same thing. You have a non-compliant section of your program. So you want everybody to be able to get the same experience. The same goes for things like arenas, people coming to Las Vegas that want to see a show. The only accessible space in that theater is the back row. That's not acceptable. You want to offer them at least a relative, comparatively same experience. That doesn't mean that they get their choice of every single row of the 100 or 200 rows that you have, but maybe one in the front row at the highest price point, one in the middle at the mid-point price point, and then one all the way in the back, which is at the low price point. So that, again, they get the same cost of participation in terms of dollars, and they get the same choices that people who are not wheelchair users get. There's a lot of design stuff that needs to go with this. For instance, if you're building a wheelchair location in an arena or in a theater, then when everybody else stands up, the wheelchair user can't have a blocked view. So this takes some thinking to figure out how it's going to work. And then carrying on, remember that not all persons with disabilities are wheelchair users. So some people are hearing impaired, and some are using walkers and different things like that. And so this disability regulation compliance tends to get a tunnel vision on wheelchair users, which of course is important, and there are a lot of wheelchair users out there, but also to keep in mind that there are other disabilities that your hotel room has to comply with for persons with hearing impairments, and depending on the type of facility, the different kind of concerns that you might have for people with different disabilities. So add to that, in finality, staff training. Some things are just sensitivity training. For instance, if you're training your staff to help people with disabilities, then they're not supposed to ask, like, what's wrong with you? They're supposed to ask, can you do this? So say somebody's in a wheelchair, and it's entirely permissible to ask them if they want to transfer onto a regular chair, let's say in your dining room. Are you able to do this by yourself? What can I do to help you? And then a lot of people that are wheelchair users are entirely capable of momentarily getting up out of the wheelchair and sitting down on something else. But if not, then you can't say, do you have terminal cancer, or is your back broken, or something like that. You're supposed to just say, how can I assist you in transferring to the wheelchair? So just like, or from the wheelchair, just like any other medical condition, it's really none of your business what the person has wrong with them, and you're just trying to facilitate them sufficiently for the business that you're in. And the same thing goes for people who are employees. And so remember, when you're complying with the disability regulations, it's not just visitors, it's not just employees, it's not just a certain segment of the population who's going to come there. It's anybody with a disability who you want to make your facility open to. So last but not least, if you have an existing facility, it was built 25 years ago, according to current regulations that say the Uniform Federal Accessibility Standards, UFAS, or something like that. and then you think you're done. I'm done. I don't have to do anything to it. We're not remodeling. This is not true. So if you're accepting federal money for something, then you have triggered ADA compliance, and so therefore you are going to have to comply with the ADA independently of a proposed construction project. So let us say you have a small hotel and you're accepting military vouchers for overnight stays, then you have to bring your facility up to ADA compliance to be able to do that. Same thing for meals. If you're accepting vouchers for meals, we ran into a client many years ago that had a little office building that had a bunch of suites in it that had never been remodeled, and one of the suites had a company move into it that was accepting federal money, and that triggered ADA compliance there. So always remember, when you're remodeling an existing facility, an existing tenant improvement or something like that, there's no concept of grandfathering in the ADA. That just doesn't exist. And so you have to bring it up to the current standards. Now, when we're talking about design, I recommend approaching design a number of different ways. The first one is, when you're doing a site survey, if something complies, then that's it, it complies. But when you're designing as an architect or an engineer, I always recommend putting in a substantial safety factor. So let us say the maximum slope of a sidewalk could be 2%, then I would never design to 2%. The maximum I would design to would be like 1.75%, or I would more likely say that the slope on the sidewalk would be between 0.5% and 1.5%, a range for them to pour the sidewalk, because of the nature of the construction process. Trying to hit anything dead on the money is near impossible. And then keeping that high number, 0.5% away from the 2% max that's allowed. So when you're looking at what do I have to do, you have to kind of look at it in that context. As a design professional, providing a safety factor for constructability, and as a building owner, then looking at what is the real requirement when you have a site survey done, or if you're somebody like me who does site surveys, then what is the real requirement. So if you're at 2.1% and 2 is allowed, that's a fail. There is no kind of close. It's not horseshoes or hand grenades. They were very clear about how they wrote the ADA itself specifically, that when it says do not exceed 2%, that really means do not exceed 2%. And so I have some contractors try to argue different things, but the language is very clear about these things. And so if the architect or civil engineer put on the plan to slope the sidewalk at 2%, and they didn't do a range, then you should RFI it and ask them, hey, if I'm between 1.5 and 2%, is that okay? And then you should know in your own mind, having read the regulations, if you're a concrete installer, you should know 2% is the max for what I'm doing at this moment. Do not hit 2.1%. And so then all your work is constructed per compliance with the ADA or the other regulations that I just talked about. So that's a quick overview of what all is involved. My name is Ken Small. Contact info will be attached here, as will a link to the website. And we hope if you have more questions or you need an ADA consultant, you'll give us a call.